I'm going to also time myself so I don't go up.
To the mic.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here, for staying right before lunch, and thank you, of course, to the organizers as well. It's really exciting to be here with you all to share this little piece of a much larger kind of dissertation project. We're dealing today in this presentation with the Aden colony, but first I want to take us to the Eastern Aden Protectorate in the year 1943. Dozens of men stand at the ready in a fortress at Mokalla, clutching their rifles. They are black men, enslaved descendants of ancestors kidnapped from the Swahili coast or other parts of Africa, sometimes from other British protectorates, and brought for sale in British-dominated Oman. When the Kuwaiti Sultan tried to cut their rations, they rebelled, took over the fort, and took their stand. Now, though, two ships appear on the horizon. One, a warship. The other, a troop carrier full of Indian soldiers. The Sultan's son, who became the crown prince after the British colonists in Aden wrote to their colleagues in India to trap and forcibly exile his uncle, who was previously heir to the throne, takes the enslaved men's side, as is his mother, the elderly Sultana. But it's too late when they do so. 2 years earlier, the British resident advisor and the neighboring Kathiri Sultanate had urged no concessions to enslaved people's resistance. Quote, "Interference by slaves in state affairs," he said, "will not be countenanced." Now, the British were supplying the Indian troops to resoundingly make that point. The enslaved men's rebellion was doomed. I want to note in this story the manifold entanglements of Aden with the Indian Ocean world. A sultan who made his fortune in investments in Java and elsewhere in the Indian Ocean, backed by the British in a protectorate system based in part on the Malayan model, uses British-supplied Indian troops to confront men from or descended from Eastern Africa via Oman, and his son, who was empowered through the Adeni Indian imperial diplomatic pathway. The cast of characters in this story is very diverse, but not neutrally so. They're caught and catch one another in webs and hierarchies of power, all conditioned by the overriding force of British colonialism. That is what I hope to emphasize in this talk. I'm calling it, as you see, the limits of British cosmopolitanism, because I want to emphasize that diversity is still structured by power, especially under a colonial system. We've heard a lot, we've mentioned several times, it's in the conference name, that Aden was a very cosmopolitan city, a bustling port under British administration, and hosted people from all different parts of the world. And we all know that Aden was administered from India for a very long time, though we've dwelt upon it less, although it's come up. It's also important to note that the British protectorate in Somaliland was launched from Aden. So that history of Aden as a leverage point for British colonization in the Red Sea region needs to be understood if we're to situate Aden in its colonial, political, and historical context as well. So with that, I'll dive into the substance of the talk, which is about British immigration policy during the 1930s and 40s. In this period, British colonial policymakers made a series of attempts to regulate immigration to Aden. When they did so, they were concerned not only with the colony's total population, although generally they claimed that's what they were focused on, but also with its ethnic makeup. In 1949, as we all know and have discussed, they permitted the large-scale immigration of Yemeni Jews on their way to Israel, and with them, Adeni Jewish immigration. The preceding years, though, saw several attempts to discourage Jews from crossing the border into Aden. The debate over Jewish immigration did not take place in a vacuum, but drew upon contemporary discussions about the migration of Yemeni Arabs, Africans, and Indians. In this presentation, I will attempt to demonstrate the ways in which internal policy debates, often carried out in the margins of draft legal texts, reflect British colonial attempts to use immigration regulation and deportations as a means of controlling the ethnic composition of the Aden colony. If we go back to here. Great, thank you. Terrific, thank you very much. If we go back to the 1930s, we'll find that regularizing immigration policy was not a top priority for British colonial officials in Aden, but they had one grave concern, which was the growing presence of Africans in the colony. Aden is a short boat ride away from the Horn of Africa, and East Africans were inevitably a major presence in the colony. British colonial officials in Aden, though, exhibited a strong tendency toward anti-black racism. One official described Somalis as, quote, untrustworthy and dangerous, saying that although there are presumably a few good ones, we've heard a phrase like that before, British officers had assessed the qualities of the race as a whole. Immigration restrictions became even more desirable in 1941, with an increase at that time in immigration from Djibouti. Notably, at the same time, the British showed no interest in regulating the land border between Aden and Yemen, despite ever-tense relations with their northern neighbor. The registration procedures at that time exempted cargo coolies, laborers, and there was also no systematized process of even checking the documentation of people crossing the northern land border into Aden. In 1942, the British colonial officials of Aden did manage to produce a formal immigration ordinance. It specified that land crossings would still not require a passport or any other sort of documentation, but British officers were entitled to demand documentation if they saw fit to do so. But it also exempted immigrants arriving by dhow, but importantly maintains the right of British officials and police to demand documentation at will. As a later British report indicated, these provisions were used specifically to target Somalis. This is a quote, "In practice, they, travel documents, are not demanded except in respect of Somalis arriving by dhow." The early 1940s thus saw the formalization and racialization of immigration to Aden by sea. By then, though, the colonists had already been deporting Somalis for years. In the deportation proceedings recorded in the archives, the intersection of race and class is apparent. Somalis who could be identified as vagrants, unemployed, or unproductive could be and were deported through the 1930s and 40s. Even employed Somalis, accused of having a history of unemployment, were subject to deportation. I found a document where a removal order was rescinded after it became apparent that the victim was actually doing serious business in Aden. He had been incorrectly recorded as unemployed, basically just because he was Somali and scheduled for removal. Nevertheless, clearly impoverished Somalis were targeted. Two disturbing documents in the British archive list marks of identification for several deported Somalis, which represent some of the ways that these people bore their trauma on their bodies. Cut mark on the left side of chest, scar on forehead, scar on back of neck, long cut on the left side ribs on back, cuts on stomach, long marks of burn on right side of chest. We have no indication of where these wounds originated, but they hint at lives of deprivation and torment. Because any police officer could arrest someone on suspicion of being a vagrant, or having bad character, or having previously been deported, anyone of African descent was potentially vulnerable. Deportations thus allowed for post facto discrimination by police even after African migrants made it through the discriminatory dhow procedure, and even if they had been living in Aden for most of their lives, as they were in some of these cases. In the mid-1930s, and this picture, I've taken this picture from a different context. In the mid-1930s, the British began to target Jewish migrants from Yemen with similar policies. First, they issued an ordinance against the arrival of indigent Jews. Like Somalis deemed unproductive, those Jews who arrived without money could be barred from the colony. In 1939, however, the Jewish issue became more urgent. The British became concerned with a rumor that the government in London was contemplating Jewish settlement on a large scale in the Hadramaut. The rumor was not entirely baseless, actually. There had been some discussion in British circles about using the protectorate island of Socotra as a dumping ground, safely far from England's shore, for Jewish refugees fleeing the Nazis. The British colonists in charge of Aden, though, had quickly quashed the idea and excused Aden of responsibility for Jewish refugees, joining most of the world in condemning Europe's Jews to death in the Holocaust. It was too late to avoid local trouble, though. Word of the proposal leaked, there was some public discussion about what it would mean, and the British colonists reacted by shutting down Jewish immigration to Aden completely, including from Yemen, as best they could. Because the British did not want, though, to close the border to Yemeni Arabs, and the land border into Aden remained porous, and usually penetrable with the right bribes or disguises, they resolved to hunt Yemeni Jews down where they were living in Aden and deport them by force. Yemeni Jews were subject to deportation under the same Vagrants and Undesirables ordinance that was used to target East Africans. In 1943, though, a remarkable act of civil disobedience stopped the British policy in its tracks. A group of Yemeni Jewish women, rather than allow themselves to be dragged away and deported, threw themselves down to the ground in front of the truck wheels. Afraid of bad press, Adeni Governor John Hathorne Hall suspended the deportations. A couple years later, Bernard Riley from the Colonial Office urged a resumption of deportations even at the cost of bad press, writing, quote, "If Aden were glutted with unwanted immigrants from any other neighboring country, such for instance as Somaliland or Ethiopia, the remedy would be to return them to their native country, and this has, in fact, long been the practice in respect of Somalis, who often try to flock into Aden in numbers larger than the colony can absorb. if a considerable number of these people were returned to Yemen, these people being Jews, the result would be not only an easing, if not a solution, of the local problem of congestion in Aden, but would also be a strong deterrent to a continued influx of Yemeni Jews to the colony. Here again, policing of Somalis serves as a model for policies directed against Yemeni Jews. I want to emphasize again, though, that the idea that Riley is saying that British policy was motivated by overpopulation is belied by their continuing disinterest in regulating Arab migration from Yemen. Jewish protests of various kinds continued to succeed, actually, against deportations, and the British found it extremely difficult to deport Jews en masse. Somalis had tried to resist deportation through legal channels, and had sometimes succeeded on an individual basis, but had failed to spur any larger reassessment by the British. Jews were more successful. Further civil disobedience largely foiled a 1947 deportation attempt, and over the following years, Adeni Jewish elites negotiated the release of hundreds of Jews after they were arrested and scheduled for removal. The early 1947 incident bears further discussion. Close to midnight on the night of March 12th, Adeni Jews were woken from their slumber by the, quote, heartrending cries of their refugee co-religionists. Some of the refugees struggled against their captors, while others scattered and hid. Someone thought to awaken the Zionist representative, Berman, who tried to intervene in real time. He drove to the homes of various colonial officials, but all of them refused to meet with him. And he was only admitted to the governor's office the following morning, at which time he presented his case for the release of the detainees unsuccessfully. The governor also rebuffed a petition circulated by DJ Aish. Although those efforts failed to win the release of the detained refugees, only 53 people were ultimately deported. The small number of deportations resulted not from petitions or closed-door meetings, but rather from the actions of the refugees themselves and the Adeni Jews of the Jewish quarter. Salim Benin would later point to the refugees' own resistance to the police during that raid, and Armando Nassim mentioned that most of the refugees on the streets, quote, alarmed by the panic and the frightful screams of the victims, took at once refuge in the houses and go-downs. While some refugees managed to make the work of the police slow and difficult and cried out warning to the others, the rest must have pounded on the doors of the Jewish quarter for help. Adeni Jewish families, jolted awake by the fracas, must have rushed to their doors and admitted their co-religionists into their houses and cellars to hide. These reports illustrate the success in 1947, as in earlier years, of civil disobedience, with the British police prepared to drag protesting women onto trucks and whisk them off to jail. They would only be foiled by the union of Yemeni and Adeni Jewish resistance. Those refugees who struggled against the police and split the night with their cries bought time for their friends and family members to escape, but it was Adeni Jews who refused to be complicit in the British deportation project and shelter their co-religionists. Only a few dozen Jews were ultimately deported, as I said, and Governor Reginald Stuart Champion admitted the following year that he was reticent to try the tactic again because of the, quote, indelible and unpleasant picture of the Yemenite Jewesses throwing themselves to the ground to resist deportation. Even emptying Aden entirely of its Somali and Yemeni Jews, though, it's a little later, a total of less than 8,000 people altogether, probably would not have resolved Aden's actual overpopulation problem. Between 1931 and 1946, the population of the colony increased by more than 80% to some 80,500 people. The large majority of immigrants during that time were neither Somalis nor Jews, nor Indians, but Yemeni Arabs. Whether because of the colonists' discriminatory policies or other factors, Aden had actually become markedly more Arab over the 30s and 40s. In November of 1947, the British established a commission to make a serious attempt to determine an immigration policy for Aden, with an emphasis on housing and employment. They were considering targeting Indian immigration. In the late 1940s, as Hindu-Muslim relations exploded over the partition of the Indian subcontinent, the British became concerned with Indian immigration to the colony. The British feared that Hindu-Muslim tensions in one part of the now former empire could spur conflict in another. They had similar fears about Somali-Arab conflict following an outbreak of violence in Mogadishu in January of 1948, and even decided to deport some impoverished Arabs who had arrived in Aden from Mogadishu, lest their presence spark resentment. For nearly a decade before the December 1947 anti-Jewish riots, moreover, the British had been concerned that events in Palestine would destabilize Adeni intercommunal relations. Given the British tendency to regulate migration in Aden in response to ethnic conflicts elsewhere in the British imperial and mandatory system, it's not surprising that the authorities established a commission of inquiry in 1947 to deal with this issue. The December 1947 anti-Jewish riots, though, changed the British calculus yet again. For the first time, it became clear that a large, underemployed Yemeni Arab population could threaten the stability of the colony. The commission of inquiry that was meant to target Indian migrants, therefore, was redirected against Yemeni Arabs. Once again, the British officials' ethnic management project was inseparable, though, from their economic interests. Although the British had political reasons to exclude Indian migrants, the Commission ultimately associated them with forms of skilled labor, which was a choice that they made, really, that were in short supply. Yemeni Arab laborers, by contrast, increasingly found themselves underemployed, constituting an impoverished class that the Commission regarded as a breeding ground for, quote, crime and hooliganism and other social evils. According to one officer, some 3,000 Arab and Somali people regularly waited around the Aden port for small jobs. The Commission's recommendations to control immigration from Yemen were thus based ultimately on the financial interests of companies operating in the colony, once the labor market was anyway so oversaturated that low-wage workers would never be scarce. One suggestion was the formal issuance of temporary permits, dependent on the long-term employment of the migrant as attested by their employers. Another was the registration of the colony's current residents, including a recommendation that in some cases their identity cards be deposited in the quote-unquote safe custody of their employers. The Commission frames these requirements as, quote, based on the absorptive capacity of the colony. But the combination of exemptions for Indian laborers and recommendations that tied Arabs' immigration status to the whims of their employers suggests that these policies were of a piece with the contemporary British tendency to deport Arabs involved in labor strikes. Immigration legislation put the policing capacity of the British colonial state at the service of companies, who were thus invited to deploy state power against their workers at will. The Commission insisted that, quote, the type of control the committee has in mind, it is thought, would not affect any necessary supply of labor, nor should it make it more expensive, as the supply could always be regulated so that there was ample. In other words, although the housing crisis and the riots in 1947 were both cited as driving motivations of the Commission, the interests of businesses would always remain front and center. This is especially clear in light of the letter that founded the Commission. In this letter, Kirkbride, who wrote it, cited Maltese legislation that required new immigrants to prove that they had prearranged for accommodations for housing before entering the colony, a requirement that the regime in Aden, in adapting the legislation, exchanged for proof of employment at an established company. Immigration legislation with respect to Yemeni Arabs was primarily, then, a way to regulate the labor market, and to do so in favor of Adeni businesses. In developing its recommendations, the Aden regime drew on British colonial legislation in Malta, Kenya, Uganda, and East Africa. To conclude, British immigration policy, then, was determined by a balancing of political and economic interests against the ethnic biases of the British authorities. The administrators of Aden favored Yemeni Arab and Indian migrants over Africans and Jews. They privileged economic interests over the stability of the colony, in making decisions about the former groups, tying their decisions about Yemeni Arab immigration to employment rather than housing, even while insisting that the regulations were motivated by impoverished Yemeni Arabs' participation in the anti-Jewish riots and perceived likelihood of committing crimes, and prioritizing the need for skilled labor over their fears of Hindu-Muslim violence. And again, the ethnic component there is very pronounced because they even actually, there was an application, there were sub-applications, to train Adenis or also Yemeni migrants and Somalis in those kinds of quote-unquote skilled labor, and those were denied. It was considered impossible to train people in those things. By contrast, East African migrants, though most likely to be deported if they were unhoused, were targeted for race-based exclusion over Yemeni Arabs of identical economic prospects and other passengers on the same boat. The same boat would come and the police would discriminate. And also that crowd of 30,000 people at the port included both Arabs and Somalis, but it was only Somalis who were targeted. Although initially excluding only impoverished Jewish migrants again in 1935, the British were eventually willing to slow down the economic growth of the colony in order to disincentivize Jews from living there. And that's all.